and welcome. I'm Rawia Alami and this is the Dailies, where we take a look at important news stories, reports, analyses and articles published in newspapers and media outlets across the world. One news story dominated all front pages of newspapers today: the Alaska summit between American President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. The New York Times tried to answer the question of why does Trump want to speak to Putin in one of its reports. The newspaper explores the upcoming Alaska summit between the two leaders, marking Russia's first high-level engagement with the US since its isolation over Ukraine. The piece argues that Trump's push for the meeting is driven less by strategic necessity than by personal ambition, notably his desire to be seen as a global deal maker and Nobel Prize contender. The report also details concerns from Ukraine, NATO and other allies that Trump might grant concessions or even weaken collective security. They caution that the summit's symbolism could overshadow substance, with Putin benefiting from renewed legitimacy. The piece portrays the event as a calculated but risky move in a volatile geopolitical climate. Moving on to the Washington Post, which published an article for Anna Husarska analyzing Donald Trump's proposal for a territorial land swap between Russia and Ukraine, contending it would legitimize aggression while causing deep humanitarian harm as well. Transferring Ukrainian-held parts of Donetsk to Russian control could indeed displace hundreds of thousands, many already traumatized by past occupation. The piece also warns of long-term instability and regional decline, and also the author argues that even if political realities force concessions in the future, the immediate costs are refugee crisis and human suffering, as well as destabilizing, and all of that outweighs potential diplomatic benefits. The review highlights a compelling humanitarian argument, though it leaves military and strategic counterpoints less explored. Michael Kimmage wrote in the Wall Street Journal asking, can the US still be Europe's peacemaker? Kimmage, by the way, is a professor of history at the Catholic University of America and the author of Collisions: The War in Ukraine and the Origins of the New Global Instability. The author examines America's declining role in European conflict resolution using the Trump-Putin Alaska summit as a case study. Now, historically, the US played a central role in European peace treaties, from Versailles to the Dayton Accords, often backed by military power and political commitment. Kimmage argues that the US today lacks both leverage and political will, limiting its ability to broker meaningful peace in Ukraine. The article argues that while Trump seeks diplomatic engagement, Putin's history of delaying tactics and administration's intention to reduce US involvement weaken the chances of a successful outcome. Ultimately, the piece suggests that Ukraine and its European allies, not the US, will likely determine the war's resolution. Moving on to the Times, which examines in its analysis the key issues likely to shape the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, the first meeting between the two leaders since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Now, topics include Ukraine's Donbas region and contested oceanfront territories, security guarantees, the strategic placement of US missiles in Europe, access to oil and rare earth minerals in Russian-occupied areas, and sanctions. Notably, the humanitarian crisis involving abducted Ukrainian children is excluded from the discussions. The piece highlights also the complex interplay between geopolitical strategy, economic interests, and also military considerations, suggesting that while the meeting may open dialogue, significant breakthroughs on Ukraine's sovereignty and security remain unlikely. The summit reflects both leaders' priorities and limitations in shaping post-war outcomes. Despite widespread wariness of the possible outcomes of the summit, Le Monde reported cautious optimism among European leaders as they still see hope for a ceasefire. The report provides a timely overview of diplomatic maneuvering ahead of the Alaska summit, including a video conference with US President Donald Trump, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The piece also emphasizes Trump's commitment and not to negotiate Ukrainian territory without Zelensky and his willingness to consider security guarantees as well. The report also examines European discussions on potential military support for Ukraine, ranging from training to a small reassurance force. Overall, the piece effectively contextualizes the summit's objectives, balancing cautious hope for a ceasefire with the uncertainties inherent in US and European commitments. The Moscow Times published an article by Ruth Diamond critiquing the Trump-Putin summit as a dramatic shift in US foreign policy that abandons traditional allies while favoring Moscow. She situates the meeting in historical context, noting that hosting Russian leaders on US soil has historically signaled recognition and respect, but under Trump, it conveys deference. Diamond highlights the summit's last-minute organization and also lack of clear objectives and sidelining of experienced diplomats, framing it as evidence of chaos and incompetence in foreign policy making. The article also warns that the event strengthens Putin's international position, giving Russian prestige and leverage, while weakening NATO and also support for Ukraine. The piece serves as both a critique of Trump's approach and also a cautionary assessment of its strategic consequences for the West. The Financial Times reported today on Israel's growing international isolation following the Gaza war. The report highlights how global criticism, diplomatic pressure, and economic sanctions, from European arms embargoes to divestment by Norway's sovereign wealth fund, have strained Israel's international standing. Public sentiment in the US and Europe has shifted, with declining support for military actions and rising recognition of a Palestinian state. Israeli officials express concern over long-term repercussions for trade, for technology, academic collaboration, and also tourism, as illustrated by protests in Greece and the blocking of cruise passengers. Despite global censure, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu remains defiant, framing international pressure as external political interference rather than a threat to national policy. Back to the Washington Post now, as in light of what many Americans call President Trump's attack on American democracy, Matt Bai wrote, arguing that the fragility of US democracy amid President Trump's unprecedented actions stems less from institutional failure than from public inaction. It also contends that while Congress, the judiciary, and other pillars of government hesitate or defer, the electorate holds the ultimate responsibility to check executive overreach. Of course, drawing also on historical examples such as Nixon's resignation, the piece also emphasizes impeachment as a voter-driven mechanism rather than merely a congressional or judicial tool. The author critiques centrists and also conservative voters who tolerate Trump's agenda for perceived policy gains, suggesting that this enables executive misconduct. Ultimately, the article calls on the American people to exercise accountability, portraying civic engagement as the essential safeguard for democratic norms. In her article in The Guardian, Rebecca Solnit critiques Donald Trump's 2025 attempt to assert control over Washington, D.C., framing them as hypocritical power grabs, echoing the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Solnit emphasizes the contrast between Trump's claims of rising crime and the actual data showing a 30-year low. highlighting the administration's broader record of both visible and systemic violence, including international and domestic harm. She also argues that Trump's authoritarian tactics target diverse, progressive urban centers, portraying them as dangerous to justify draconian measures while privileging certain groups over others. The article also underscores the role of propaganda and exaggeration in sustaining right-wing agendas, and warns that the struggle over cities, rights and diversity reflects a larger battle against authoritarianism and societal pluralism in the United States. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.